We are back to the Rosaceae and plant list 4. So we left off talking about Cotoneaster, and we are now going to shift gears and start talking about Eriobatria. So Eriobatria is a tree or large shrub, and when we say the name Eriobatria, there are several members in the genus, and we're looking at the species Eriobatria deflexa. Eriobatria deflexa is a medium water use plant or moderate water use plant, and it is referred to as the bronze loquat. So there are loquats that are edible plants. Eriobatria japonica is the common one that we would eat. When we're looking at bronze loquat, the goal is an ornamental plant, one that we use for aesthetic value in a landscape, not as a food product. So you might see the name loquat and you might be familiar with eating loquats. This is not that loquat, not the one that you might be familiar with as an edible crop. This is an example of some along a sidewalk by a street planting in these little planter beds. So it's a small tree. It's evergreen, somewhere between 10 and 20 feet tall typically. It can reach about 25 feet tall and wide if it's given room to grow, but you can keep them smaller as well. This is a typical appearance for one. That these are middle-aged trees. They've probably been in for 20 years or so. New growth on the plant is often this pinkish or bronze color. So it looks interesting. It gives multiple colors in the canopy. The leaves are evergreen. They're going to stay dark green typically. But as new growth emerges, you get that bronze or pink color, which can be somewhat attractive. Here is one in a landscape. You can see a flush of new growth. From a distance, it almost looks like the tree is flowering. That's just new growth in the late spring, early summer. When the plant is in full bloom, the flowers are very attractive. So here is a close-up of the cluster of flowers. So the flower is held typically on a raceme, which is a branched inflorescence, or just irregular clusters of flowers. They are white with kind of that brown or cream colored receptacle or sepals down at the bottom. So they have an interesting kind of multicolored, lots of cream and a little bit of green and white in color. They contrast nicely with the leaves, which are very impressive. Following the flowers, later in the season, we see the fruit forming. So the fruits, once again, this is not one that we tend to eat. This is a little pome, just like loquat would be that you would eat, but the overall size on this particular one, it's usually under an inch in diameter, maybe around 3/4 of an inch. And there is a lot of the actual fruit inside and not so much of the fleshy hypanthium around the outside. So a little something there to eat, not a lot. It's not poisonous. You could eat it. I guess we could say, I put on your plant list that it's barely edible. That's probably a good descriptor. So you can eat it. It won't make you sick, but it's not a very rewarding experience to eat bronze loquat. This plant is used in the landscape typically as a flowering tree or as a container plant, as a patio tree, a small-sized ornamental tree. It will drop those fruits, so you do have the potential for some fruit drop, but it is evergreen in leaf, and generally the fruits will often shrink up a little bit, right? The pomes will shrink a little bit and then drop to the ground, or birds will do a good job taking some of them away. So I wouldn't say it is a very, very messy landscape tree, but it's definitely not a very clean one either. So that is bronze loquat, moderate water use plant in California. Here is Heteromeles. Heteromeles arbuetifolia. Heteromeles arbuetifolia is referred to as toyon, or Christmas berry, or California holly. This is a native plant to California that is capable of looking much like the Cotoneaster lacteus that we looked at that was invasive. So if you're wanting a good substitute, a shrub form of this plant could make a very, very attractive landscape plant with red fruit and white flowers. It can have a tree form or it can have a large shrub form. This is the tree form right here. And sometimes that just comes with age. Other times that's pruning, and other times that's the actual selection you're buying. You're buying one that tends to be compact and rounded in form, or tends to be upright, tall, and thin in form. The shrub-like form right here Has red fruit all over it, high quality evergreen foliage. And so what you'll often see is that you get a form similar to this. If you go in and start removing some lower branches, you can encourage a tree form, but shrubby forms of heteromeles are very common, very, very common. Here is the foliage up close, high foliage quality, a bright green color. Here are the flowers. So it is 5-petaled, yellow, has the fused petals. Here, this is that middle flower type that we were looking at briefly when we were looking at ovary position. Not that it really matters all that much, but it forms a poem. So this is a close-up of the flower. There's a bee flying by. This plant's very popular with pollinators. They tend to like it. And here are the fruits, little poems that form usually bright red, sometimes a little bit of an orange red in color. So native range for heteromeles, lot of distribution on the coast and moving inland into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, especially moving central or north. Not so much down in towards low desert areas. So with this plant, it is a widely distributed native plant in California and offers interesting flowers, fruits, and foliage. This, according to some people, is the plant that Hollywood is named after. They say it's named after this California holly. That is debatable whether or not that's the real inspiration for Hollywood, but it's one of the stories. This plant was regularly collected as a holiday decoration in California, and in fact, the collection of heteromeles led to some of the laws that we have that regulate private property or the way people collect plant material. Some of it was the widespread theft of these plants in the winter to be used as decorations. And so it got some protection for plant material in private property. It's a flowering shrub and tree. It has very interesting fruit. It's a screen. It's a California native. Very common plant. Relatively adaptable in terms of California native plants. This is one that does a relatively good job coming from a nursery and then establishing in a landscape. We see a lot of this plant bought and sold in California. It is a very low water use plant in California. Some areas you could say it moves towards just low water use, but very low water on the Central Coast and in much of the state. Fernleaf ironwood is the next plant we are about to look at. In this case, we are looking at a subspecies. This is the only subspecies that we will look at in the quarter. And so here's the story with the subspecies and with this particular plant. So Lionothamnus floribundus subspecies aspleniifolius is an ironwood that is native to particularly Santa Cruz Island. And it has a little bit of localized distribution, and it's very common in the landscape industry. But it has a very highly specialized characteristic or trait, and that is having this fern leaf or cut leaf appearance on the foliage. So a subspecies is when we have a species that separates out into groups based largely on geography or location. So in this case, we have the establishment of this particular plant in one little pocket, really, or just a few little native stands of fernleaf ironwood. And that has led to this being deemed a subspecies as opposed to a variety, saying that this variation is localized and limited to an area. And then we have another subspecies that's localized, and I believe that's Lionothamnus floribundus, subspecies floribundus, as the same subspecies as specific epithet. So when we're seeing these in native distribution, they are the same species, but they've separated in space and they look different from each other. They don't look the same. For quite a while, actually, I made several changes to this plant this year in plant materials. So I want to give you a heads up about that. One is I used to call this a variety. Botanically, this is probably best described as a subspecies. So I made that adjustment. I also, in the past, didn't put in one of the I's here. I called it aspleniifolius instead of aspleniifolius, right, the double I in there. And after reviewing the publication of the name going back through records, the second I should be there. It should be present. So I added that back in. And then I used to put in the word Catalina with this name, because Catalina ironwood is the general name given for Lionothamnus floribundus as a species. But the fernleaf ironwood does not grow on Catalina Island. So it's kind of a nonsense to say fernleaf Catalina ironwood or Catalina fernleaf ironwood. If you put the Catalina word in there, you can't find it there. It doesn't grow there. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. So you will sometimes see this called Santa Cruz Island fernleaf ironwood, but the simple version is fernleaf ironwood. That should get you to the right plant. So here is that fernleaf that we talked about. Very, very interesting foliar structure. So it's a compound leaf and is really fascinating about just what it is. Is it palmately compound? Is it pinnately compound? There's a lot going on in that subdivided leaflet. When we look at it, and that depends on the individual leaf that you look at, right? About how you classify it. So the leaf shape is very interesting and distinctive, and it's a dominant aesthetic quality of the plant. The reason it gets used in landscapes, part of it is that leaf. The bark is shaggy and brown, also is interesting in a landscape. So the bark is also a drawing card. And then the flowers are plentiful. They're classic Rosaceae flowers, 5-petaled. And they are small, but there are large numbers of them in clusters. And so they are popular as well. So we don't see large distribution of this particular plant. So it's a California native, but only in a narrow range. If you're growing this in San Luis Obispo, I would not bill it as a native plant in this area. But it is a plant that is well adapted to a climate similar to the Central Coast. And so it can do quite well here. It's a flowering tree. This one can be a little tricky to buy. Culturing this plant, growing it, propagating it is tricky. It's not an easy plant to grow. And so for that reason, sometimes it can be expensive to buy. And in addition to that, most of the propagation that is done through layering, which is a propagation technique that usually results in clones, but they seem to have variable root quality when they are produced from layers. And so this means that some are better than others in terms of how they perform. So they're on campus. Right now we're having a virtual quarter, so we're not spending time on campus. But right by the University Union, there is a ring or a line of the fernleaf ironwoods, some of them in containers, some of them in the ground, and many of them went in at the same time, in the same planting. And they range dramatically in size and in appearance, even though they are technically clones, and we would expect them to all look the same. It's a testament to that variability. In California, this is a low water use plant on the Central Coast, and so it has been a very popular plant for the interesting foliage. It's usually going to grow somewhere between 20 and 30 feet. Could be just a little taller than that, and maybe 10 to 15 feet wide as it ages. Another plant in the Rosaceae that has quite a bit of national popularity, but less California popularity, is Physocarpus opulifolius. Now, Physocarpus was one of those plants that was just kind of cruising along. Plant collectors had it. It was out there. No one was really all that interested in it. It was native to Central and Eastern North America. So you'd see it in those areas in native landscapes. Birds liked it. And it was one of those plants that just kind of was there. And it had reasonably nice fall color, but wasn't used much in landscapes. And then people started making selections of 9-bark, Physocarpus opulifolius, that had excellent fall color. And then in addition to that, they developed selections that had high levels of anthocyanins all year long. So I'm going to show you that in just a moment. This is the species. It has an interesting leaf shape, often a pinkish to red colored stem. And here it is in flower. The flower is not very ornamental. In fact, it almost looks like it misses flowering sometimes. The flowers are so tiny, and they're often white or cream colored, kind of tucked together. It doesn't really look all that ornamental. But what follows, where the pedicels are, where the fruit attaches, you can see a red color. And so that can be very interesting. But what you're getting a preview of in this slide is why the plant became very popular. These are the leaves with anthocyanin content. So they are purple from the spring to the summer to the fall, and then the plant goes deciduous, they drop off. So it is a purple-leafed plant in the landscape with these red pedicels left behind with the fruit. And it tends to be, it's a low water use plant in California, but it tends to be very good at surviving in hot conditions in eastern landscapes where rain keeps it alive. You don't need to irrigate it at all, but it's a good plant surviving, getting through the summer. You can cut it back going into the winter or after the winter, and then it flushes back out again, gets nice purple leaves. It's a relatively easy to grow plant that's quite tough. In California, it has the capability of looking very nice, but we tend to grow other things. It just hasn't caught on in a big way in the California market. Here are some of the selections with a really dark purple colored foliage used in contrast against other foliage colors. I took these pictures in Oregon. So it's very common in the Pacific Northwest, probably just as common as it is on the eastern and southeastern and mid-Atlantic region in the U.S., or Midwest for that matter. Most places aside from the Southwest, you'll see a good bit of 9-bark. So it has interesting foliage or foliage colors. You can also find selections that are chartreuse colored as well. It's commonly used as a screen. The plant normally grows to about 10 feet tall. There are some cultivars that are compact and small, some that are a little bigger. And it is a deciduous plant. It will die back every year. So that is Physocarpus, a plant that's popular nationwide or across the nation, but not as popular in California as some other places. A plant that seems like it should probably be in the same place, but it actually is popular in California, is the cherry plum, Prunus cerasifera. Prunus cerasifera has been rated as a limited risk for being invasive in California. And the large reason for that is that it does tend to compete well with plants around it, and the human-induced potential for invasiveness is high. It's very popular. It gets spread around all over the place in landscapes. People plant a ton of cherry plums. So Prunus cerasifera is a moderate water use plant. It's referred to as cherry plum or as flowering plum. And there is some variability in the fruit, this whole plum idea. So it's typically not a plum that is very good to eat. It is a drupe, just like an edible plum. And the biggest ones are right around an inch in size to a little bit over an inch in diameter. And they actually don't taste bad. In fact, I've actually heard people say they taste good. They can be very, very good. On your plant list, I said edible but not good because that's been my dominant experience by far. I've grown a lot of these, sold a lot of these, worked on landscapes with these, and never really appreciated the flavor of these cherry plums. But I have heard stories of people appreciating them and saying that they were tolerable. We grow this. The dominant Prunus cerasifera that we grow are selections that are purple-leaved. Now, Prunus cerasifera, if you find it in nature, and it's generally you're going to find it in Western Asia. If you find this in nature, it's going to have green leaves and a white flower. The plants that we normally grow have purple leaves and pink flowers. So selection has been done. We're usually growing clones or cultivars of the plant, and we are growing one with purple leaves. So it has high anthocyanin content in the foliage. This is what people are thinking when they put this plant in. Purple foliage on this rounded crown of the plant. Really interesting difference in color compared to the green plants around it. And it can look beautiful. Here's another one. This is an old one. Kind of gnarly looking, but purple leaves on top. Can look quite good. Now, when we see this plant in landscapes, it's common that it looks something like this. So one, this plant's deciduous, so it will drop its leaves. So it will drop its leaves every year. That's not unexpected. That's just part of its natural cycle. But the plant is also short-lived. So it will tend to die back over time, pick up. It can get various diseases incited by fungi, bacteria. It can be attacked by pests. So it's very common this plant will be killed within 20 to 25 years of planting. And when that begins to happen, you see dead branches, you see dieback occurring throughout the plant. So here's one example right here in California. Here's an example on the East Coast of a plant. This should be in full leaf like this one. You can see they've been chopping branches off of it. It's just dying rapidly. It's starting to reach serious decline. And I have a lot of pictures of Prunus cercifera in decline. It's one of the things that I just find compelling, and I feel like I have to photograph it when I see it. Here is an example of where this plant has been most problematic in terms of being invasive. So it is mainly up the Bay Area and north is where we see most invasive issues happening with cherry plum. Has not been a big deal across the entire state, but there have been some issues. So this is a flowering tree, very, very popular, can make a good host for a fungus collection. It's susceptible to pathogens, but it is a plant that is one that you're going to see available at nurseries, in landscapes. Many, many people appreciate the plant and love it. When we're talking about flowering for plants, cherry plum is one that will flower in California. You'll get some flowers on it, but it generally will not flower like it would in a very cold climate. So we're going to talk about that in just, actually, we might as well we'll do that right now. Let's jump right into the conversation about flowering of cherries. So many plants that flower, the flowering response is a response to photoperiod, day duration, and temperature. And so when we have a photoperiod change, when the days get, light time gets shorter, right, it starts getting dark earlier and earlier, there is a dormancy that happens in the flower bud. So we have photoperiod change, dormancy in a flower bud, and then what we need is vernalization to occur. And vernalization is effectively winter chill or a chilling treatment. And now, if we're looking at what that involves, that varies by species. So you might hear somebody say it's a low chill variety or a low chill cultivar. What they mean is that the buds get released from dormancy with a low amount of chilling. It doesn't take all that much. However, this is a spectrum, right? From low chill requirement to high chill requirement. Cherries in general do have some level of chill requirement. So the magic number, let me use my cursor here to write this out. For Prunus species, the usual range is, I usually write this on the board in the classroom. I'm instead using my mouse here. Something between 700 and 1200. This is what is normal. However, there are things outside of this range. 700 to 1200 hours at temperatures at or below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is what we're looking at. You need a month, right? You need a good month of temperatures at 45 or below to fully break all the dormancy in the buds. If you get less than that, some will grow, some will not grow. For some selections, almost nothing will flower. I shouldn't say the word grow, I should say flower. Some flower buds will be released. You'll get a little scattering anyway without a lot of cold, low chill condition. Others, you could see nothing, you could see just a little bit. Or for one that's very low chill, just a little bit of chilling and you'll get full flowering. So one of the big factors about whether or not Prunus species look good on the Central Coast is how long were we able to stay below 45? And here's the tricky thing. For many of them, it is continuous. So if we have one 60-degree day thrown in there, we undo the chilling that happened, right? The dormancy is reinstituted. That's a big problem in California on the Central Coast. We don't have prolonged 1 month of 45-degree temperatures. That just doesn't happen on the Central Coast. So it's very hard to have all flower buds released from dormancy in Prunus species on the Central Coast. Like I said, there's a spectrum here. Some are better than others. But when we have cold conditions consistently at 45 degrees approximately or lower for a prolonged period of time, then we're going to see impressive flowering out of our Prunus species. And if you've ever been in Chicago in the winter, or Philadelphia, or Boston, or Baltimore, or Washington, D.C., any of those places that have really impressive flowering cherries, you know that the winters are colder than 45 degrees for a month. Yeah, they push 0 for a lot of time. Not consistently, but it stays well below 45. And that's why the cherries can look so impressive in those areas. So we're now going to do another of these things that I say I don't like to do, and that is talk about the concept of just a genus. But I'm going to put a common name on here called flowering cherry. So we're talking about Prunus selections that are sold as ornamental flowering cherries. And these are mostly Prunus sargentii, Prunus seriolata, and Prunus subhirtella. Those are the 3 species in general that I'm talking about. And maybe I should actually pick one of them and just teach that one. That might be smart. But we have upright forms, we have weeping forms in this group. So they have many things in common. They are Prunus. They are closely related. Like I said, some are upright, but they have kind of this vase or rounded canopy. And others are weeping. They have this weeping form, and that's from grafting, from grafts right here at the top of the stem. Now, these plants are very popular coast to coast in the United States. We see a lot of them. The flowering is going to be most impressive areas that are cold, where we have sufficient chilling for the buds to bring them out of dormancy. Here are some in San Francisco, looking very nice in this planting. I don't know how well these flower. I haven't seen these in flower, but the plant itself looks healthy and happy in this setting. Here are some flowers. A lot of pink and white and sort of a reddish pink color when it comes to flowers. And then another thing that's associated with flowering cherries, when they're in a place that really is cold, where they are able to truly go dormant, is that cold weather response leads to excellent yellow fall color. We don't see much of this in California, at least not on the Central Coast. There are some colder parts, like you start getting into the Sierra Nevada, some of that area, you'll see some nice fall color in Prunus. Maybe a little bit in some of Northern California. But in Southern California and coastal California, not so common to see good fall color on cherries. But these are weeping cherries, beautiful yellow fall color, lots of carotenoids, the pigments in the leaf that are visible as the chlorophyll leaves the leaf. Beautiful yellow color. The flowering cherry species and selections tend to have little glands that look kind of like eyeballs right here at the leaf. So right where the petiole attaches to the leaf. So it looks like a little set of eyeballs right there. Really interesting, strange characteristic. You don't see that in many other plants. The bark is often covered in lenticels, which are splits or openings in the bark that are there for gas exchange. Many trees have lenticels. Not many have lenticels as conspicuous as Prunus. So very interesting and kind of warty openings or splits all over in the bark. You see this in the plum cherry that we looked at, or cherry plum a little bit ago, Prunus ceracifera. You see it in these as well. Very conspicuous lenticels. So here's a little conversation about Prunus gone wrong. And this is an example of ties back to when we were talking about Morus. When we were talking about Morus, I told you that with a grafted plant that has this umbrella shape, you have to watch out for vertical growth, right? The vertical branches going through. And if you don't, growth from that understock, right, from the main stem of the plant, will grow vertical and grow into the big upright form, and you'll lose that weeping form on your plant. This is an example of that happening. So these plants, I drove by these by a grocery store on the East Coast, and they made me laugh. So I stopped my car, hopped out, and took these pictures. Here is a plant that has grafted plants. There are these right here, and those right there, and that right down in there. And then all this top part is the rootstock growing through. So I saw this and I was laughing at it. And then I made a note to myself to come back when they were in flower, because I wanted to see what this looked like. I knew it was going to be funny. So I made a note for myself, wrote myself a note, go back to that spot in the spring when they're flowering. And this is what I saw. So this is the pink flowering weeping cherry down here. This is the rootstock, just a regular white flowering tree form, upright spreading form. And it won't be long before all signs of that pink are gone, just outcompeted and outgrown by the big tree. So when this plant was planted, what was anticipated was a flowering cherry that was probably 15 feet tall, that had a arching, pink flowering, arching canopy. And instead what they were going to get is a 30 to 40 feet tall tree with white flowers. Very, very different appearance. And that's because somebody wasn't watching for the upright growth growing up through past the graft union and destroying the form of the tree. So flowering cherries are flowering trees, very popular once again. We see a lot of them on the East Coast and Midwest where it gets cold because of the chilling that's available, but still very popular in California. You'll see a lot of them around the state, and popular in the Northwest as well. Pyracantha is a plant that has limited risk for invasivity, and I believe this one's on its way up. I think we're going to see this one upgraded to at least moderate, probably sometime soon. It is a plant that produces a lot of fruit and is spread by seed. It's attractive. It's an attractive fruit for animals to eat, so it's particularly problematic with birds, as in they spread the seeds around. And it's also very popular in landscapes. Now, the reason currently that it isn't higher than limited risk is we see a low establishment rate by the seeds when they get dropped in natural landscapes. But once again, I've been seeing these around. In fact, I just saw one on a hike when I was doing the Lemon Grove Loop below Cerro San Luis. And so actually a handful of them, not just one. So they're around here in our local community. That's not the only place I've seen them. I've seen them many other places, but that was one I saw just last week. We see this as a shrub form typically. You can grow it on a trellis or kind of espaliered into a very a cover for a wall, but we see a lot of it as a kind of a hedge or as a medium-sized shrub. Here is the flower. We have a classic Rosaceae flower, 5 petals, usually white. And the flower is attractive. It's a nice looking flower, but the real drawing card for this plant are the fruits. So the fruits are very similar to what we saw with some other members of the species, with the Cotoneaster and with the Heteromeles. So we've got a little palm. They range in color from orange to red to yellow. There are even some pale ones that are almost white. So there's a red selection. High foliage quality. You can see the name firethorn. You can see the thorns right there. And here's a close-up of them. So thorns are little modified branches. They are stout. They have the ability to be very sharp and can be hostile, which can be good if you don't want people to cut through a parking lot or get too close to a building. Those thorns on the firethorn can be very impressive. There are a handful of species that are popular and cultivars that are popular. And in some parts of the country, the dominant selection criteria is cold hardiness. How low of a temperature can they tolerate? They are not particularly cold hardy. And so in some places, you're limited just to the most cold hardy selections. In California, we can grow them all. And so we're not limited by temperature. And so we have lots of options. You'll see different forms and colors available. It's typically a low water use plant in California. Here is an example of where we've started to see problems. So close to the coast, and then as you move north, we've seen it. Like I said, I've seen it established here in San Luis Obispo County, right in San Luis Obispo. We tend to see it as a flowering shrub, one with interesting fruit, one that's used in hedges. You get a lot of flowering and a lot of fruiting in these plants in a landscape. This is one that I would urge caution on. Do your homework if you want to use this in a landscape. It's worth thinking about. I wouldn't say in California this has the same level of concern as, say, Cotoneaster lacteus, but it is one to think about, to really think about carefully before you use it in a landscape. Pyrus callereana is the first of 2 pairs that we are going to look at in this class. So Pyrus callereana is a moderate water use plant, and this was at one time probably the most common flowering plant in the United States. If it wasn't the most, it would have been right in the top several. And it all comes back to a cultivar called Bradford, the Bradford flowering pear. Now, Callery pear has since fallen on hard times. Its reputation has gone from being the darling tree or darling child of horticulture and nurseries to being the rebel and the shunned member of the family. So it is now illegal to sell and buy in some states, and has basically, if you talk to somebody who is a trained horticulturist and ask them for their feeling about calorie pear, usually it will be a negative response. It's hard to find positive things about this particular species, especially about the cultivar Bradford and many of the selections. So here's where all this criticism comes from. I'm going to give you the main points right up front really quickly, and then we'll continue to talk about them. So one, they have really poor branch architecture, which causes them to self-destruct. And two, they are very invasive from fruits. So those are the two big problems with the species. So here's an example of a big rounded canopy. Can have high foliage quality, lots of flowers on it, excellent fall color. All of the ornamental pears that we grow, this one and the next one we look at, have fruit that have zero food value, right? No culinary use. They're small, they're hard, they are not good at all to eat. But this rounded form would be considered the goal. Here is an example of one along a street here in California. Not quite as big as round as the one we just saw, but doesn't look bad. New growth often has this bronze color or purplish color in it, so some anthocyanins in new growth. High foliage quality when the leaves emerge. It's a deciduous tree, so it will drop its leaves every year. And in a cold climate, it gets excellent fall color. And I have to admit, I was teaching this here in California. I was frequently saying the fall color was always subpar in California in hot climates. And this past year, I was really impressed by the quality of fall color on some of the Pyrus Calorina I was seeing around the state. So I've decided to be a little more cautious about criticizing the fall color. Usually it's not as vibrant as cold locations, but it can be very nice. Purples and reds in particular. Maybe some orange too, like you're seeing in this image. This image is from the East Coast. I took this picture when it was pretty cold out. This is the fruit. This is peak fruit quality right here. That fruit is a hard fruit. Doesn't have any value as an edible. Doesn't taste good. Doesn't have a good texture. Now, here is the big concern with Bradford pear and many of the selections that are similar to Bradford. It has that big rounded canopy, and that has led to many branch attachment points at the same location. And when that happens, this could quickly move on to a further discussion in the way the tree grows, but I'll just say it this way. When you have lots of attachment points that are close together and they get secondary growth and they grow out and they grow into each other, that area is very vulnerable to splitting. And when you add in wind, ice, rain, snow, the tree just self-destructs. So with Bradford pear, this is a picture I took right after Superstorm Sandy, if you recall that, back in, was that 2000, oh my, maybe 12, maybe 10, I don't remember. It's been a while ago now. But this picture was taken after that storm came through. And while it was a storm, in the area I took this picture, it was not the middle of the storm. But Bradford pears everywhere in this neighborhood were just split and dropped to the ground. It doesn't have to be a storm that has a special name either. This was just a good old-fashioned rainstorm, also on the East Coast, caused a split and drop on this branch. This is it up close, and you can see all the attachment points there. The tree just splits and breaks out at that attachment point. This right here was a tree on one side of the street, and then you turn around and look on the other side of the street, and somebody had done some preventative maintenance to keep their trees alive. So they had chopped off most of the branches so that they had just a few survivors. This tree was not structurally weak, but it was a bit compromised, I believe, aesthetically. So whether or not that's winning, I don't know who's winning there. Maybe no one's winning. Maybe we're all losing. I'm not sure. It kind of looks a little bit like a poodle as a landscape tree. But that plant structurally was standing when its neighbor across the street that previously, imagine just big and green right here, had been a big, perfect circular canopy that split apart in a little rainstorm. So in addition to that tendency to split, so I guess I should say right now, let me grab the pen and show you. So the classic Bradford growth form is to grow up and then just develop a massive amount of branches out of the same point and then break apart, right? That's the classic Bradford problem. So there's been breeding work done. There's a cultivar called Aristocrat, Chanticleer, and they're often referred to as pyramidal growth forms. So they grow up and then they tend to develop lots of branches kind of like this, as opposed to all at one point and then being round. So this technically would go way out, right, to have the very round canopy, but all those connection points come back to that center area. The Chanticleer and Aristocrat and some of these others, you see branching way, way up and a much more conical form on the plant. Those are less likely to split, but they still split, especially where there's ice and snow. So nationally, let me pose this as a question. Where do you think that these plants have the worst reputation? Or maybe I can pose it this way. Do you think the reputation of calorie pear is the worst in Ohio or in California? Which one do you think where does it have the better reputation? So I'd usually say something like this in class, right, where we're talking about it and there's dialogue. You can explain your reasoning. I love those times because sometimes I learn new things, or I hear a thought process that's so different than the way I thought that it can really be revealing and be kind of cool. So it's worse in Ohio. And the reason is twofold. The two things I just described for you, being invasive and poor branch architecture, is made worse in Ohio because Ohio gets a lot of snow. And when you have poor branch architecture and you dump snow on top of that, it's over, right? The ice and snow, the tree busts apart. So the ice and snow condition and the sheer amount of thunderstorms and things they have makes it a problem structurally. But also, all the summer rain that they get make this plant very invasive. So this is a map with calorie pear showing across the United States where the worst issues have been seen with invasive spread. So we see a lot of issues here. We start looking at the Midwest or moving our way west, and right here on the East Coast. So some states have made this plant illegal to buy and sell in this region. Some are investigating it and thinking about it for the future. California is not seeing massive problems for being invasive, and we also don't have them breaking apart at the same rate because we just have such a moderate climate compared to a lot of the rest of the continent. But when we're looking at the plant in a landscape, it is hard to make the argument that it is a plant without flaws, right? Or it is one that should only be considered as a very favorable addition to landscapes. Now, I may have a little bit of an axe to grind here because in my neighborhood, I think I mentioned earlier they took down almost all the sweet gums in the complex I live in. Like, it's almost 40 trees, I think, that have come down recently. They're replanting many of them with calorie pears against my objection. And I am not happy to see them going up in the neighborhood. Not because I think they're going to break apart in this landscape, or even because I think they're going to be invasive. I'm not a big fan of the plant, and the flowers don't smell so great. This is something, I put it on your plant list as malodorous. You could Google pear flowers and see how they've been described in the past. Lots of people are not a fan of the scent of calorie pear flowers, especially when you have them lining a neighborhood street. It's not a good thing, not at all. Also bad for allergies, really, really bad for allergies. So this is one to think about if you're going to use a calorie pear. My recommendation, if you're going to use a pear in California, would be to consider the Pyrus kawakamii. Now, Pyrus kawakamii is a moderate water use plant as well, but it is evergreen. It has a slightly different form. It's a little bit smaller, typically, and it has usually a little bit more yellow in its fall color. So here it is, a little smaller than a calorie pear would tend to look. You can grow it as an espalier tree or form it. Here it is as a cover for one of the coolers at the horticulture unit on campus. There are those leaves up close. Here's some fall color on it. The flower and the fruits look very similar to Pyrus caloriana. Very, very similar. It's a little bit less aggressive, less likely to spread from seed than Pyrus caloriana is. So it is a flowering tree, a street tree, or a screen. And this plant is not on any invasive plant list, not illegal to grow anywhere. It does not have the same cold hardiness that Pyrus calorina has. So this tree is not a problem in Ohio because it wouldn't live there. It would die in Ohio. So I'm using Ohio as a representative for the general region where this plant is really problematic. It applies to many other states. So this plant is popular in California and in the Pacific Northwest, not as popular in cold regions because it doesn't tend to survive there. Now, some people would argue that the fall color is not quite as impressive. It doesn't really have true fall color because it's evergreen. These are the declining leaves right before they drop off the plant. But you'll get that scattered yellow appearance frequently later in the season. So we're going to stop there with Pyrus, and we're going to resume the final video for Plant List 4, looking at Raphiolepis.